fluid resuscitation. I know it doesn't say that, but this class is fluid resuscitation. I'm gonna write this up here so you don't forget. It's worth 30 minutes of CEUs. This says fluids during trauma, but this is labeled as fluid resuscitation, so make sure that that is the 1085 form that you print out. It has it on there, and get that signed and sent to your shift rep, and they'll get that put in for your CEUs for the month of September 2021. On fluid resuscitation, so I labeled that. Really what we're talking about is fluids during trauma is what the fluid resuscitation is covering. So what happens during trauma is we have blood loss, right? And then we lose blood. And since we have less blood, that leads to a lack of perfusion. And then the lack of perfusion leads to organ death. So that's really the step, the lines that happens in, right? So how do we fix that? Okay. So the traditional method to fix the lack of perfusion first is how do we know what's happening? We've always used blood pressure, right? So we have a blood pressure. In particular, we use less than 100. That's the traditional way that we determine that we had enough fluid loss to matter, and we have a lack of perfusion. We said if the blood pressure is less than 100, then we're going to need to fix that. And in trauma, the traditional number was 1 to 2 liters. Okay, when I first became a medic, 9-10 years ago, the number was 2. In a lot of places that's dropped to 1, but somewhere during that time frame, the traditional idea was if we have a blood pressure of less than 100, we're going to put the 2 biggest IVs that we could possibly find in the truck in their arms, and then we're going to give them as much blood as we possibly can, up to 2 liters for most people, but some people even back in the day less than that. I remember whenever I was a brand new medic, and it was almost like a contest for how much fluid we could give you from the trauma scene to the hospital. And you'd hear guys come in, I've done it myself, you come in, you're like, hey, I got, this happened, their blood pressure is 140 now, they've got 2 14 gauge IVs and they had 4 liters of fluid. And everyone's like, awesome, man, you're the man, way to go, okay? So over the years that became less and less, and then they really started looking into it. Okay, so this is kind of the traditional way that we did it, right? 2 IVs, as much fluid as possible, but generally it was 1 to 2 liters because you only have about 10 to 20 minutes, so that's about what you can move. Okay, so that's the traditional way. Right, so what does the science say? We did that for a long time, 20, 30 years. And what did the science figure out? So the NIH, it's listed on your 1085, or not on the 1085, but on the National Registry form that comes with it for what the lesson objectives. In that lesson content, there is the study that's in there, but it's an NIH study. That NIH study covered about a 20-year period, and they started looking into numbers and what they could find out, and what really works. Okay. The science said the way that we did it is dangerous whenever they get done. Okay. So this study runs, and we find out that the way we're doing it, there's a lot of dangers. So what are those dangers? Okay. Those dangers are the first one is that when you give a lot of fluids, you dilute. Okay, so you're diluting the clotting factors and the platelets that are in the blood. Okay, so remember that blood loss, lack of perfusion, organ death. Okay, so when we put a lot of fluids in there, we're making the blood loss worse. We're making it harder for the patient to clot. Okay, so just think like you had some. I like to think of it just like if you had some leaky plumbing, right? That's really what it is. You got a pump that's pumping, and it's pumping into this plumbing. Okay. And it's losing a bunch of fluid all over the place. We're trying to hold our hand over the water leak, right? But then we just keep putting more and more water in there, trying to fill those pipes back up, and you're making it worse and worse. The clotting factors and the platelets that your body uses to produce the initial clot, which then turns into a scab and then heals, right? That is getting diluted. So you're making it harder and harder for your body to clot. The next is you're creating pressure, obviously. We're trying to bring the blood pressure back up, okay? So you have that the pump is pumping, it's pumping against you that is trying to stop the leak, but you keep increasing the pressure back up, makes it your bandaging and your clots not work as well. Okay. Next is that we're using fluids. We're just going to call them clear fluids today. You can use all kinds of different words, crystalloids and isotonic fluids and all that. None of that really matters. You got clear fluids versus blood. Okay. So we know that our body runs off of blood. The blood, the red blood cells and the hemoglobin, they carry O2, and that is what actually perfuses your organs, right? Your organs need oxygen, and that's the problem. We lost blood, and inside of that blood in particular, we lost red blood cells and we lost hemoglobin, which carries our O2. So when we put fluids in there to replace that, fluids don't carry oxygen, right? So even though I lost half my blood and I replaced it with clear fluids, my ability to perfuse did not get that much better because it's not actually carrying oxygen. Okay? And just like I dilute the clotting factors in the platelets, I also dilute the red blood cells. Okay, so I'm mixing it now. So we had some really thick Kool-Aid, half my jar. I fill it up with all the way up with water to the top of my jar, and now instead of being red, it's pink, right? Because I diluted it. Okay, so I've now diluted that. So the clear fluids that I put in, they don't do anything other than raise pressure. That's really all they do. They don't actually help perfuse. Okay? So that's a danger. Next is temperature. Okay? So a newer way to think about this, you guys remember the March algorithm for trauma, the last one's hypothermia, right? And it was always the one that I never paid attention to. When I first started learning, I was like, they're not hypothermic. We don't deal with that many patients during the wintertime. We're not really on the side of the road that long. That's not that big of a concern. Okay? That is not what they're talking about in hypothermia. Okay? They studied this temperature problem in trauma, right? And they know that 66% of patients that arrive at the ER have what's called accidental hypothermia. Okay, so we accidentally made somebody hypothermic, right? So 66% of people do. If you get to the ER and you're hypothermic, your chances of living are half of what they would be if you were normal thermic, you had a normal body temperature. Okay? If you get to the ICU from the ER and that still happens, you now have what's called sustained hypothermia, and your chances of dying are about 4 times. Okay? So mortality, if you get the ICU hypothermia, is dramatic. You almost never make it out if you're still hypothermic. So we don't want to cause accidental hypothermia and start this problem. Okay, so why do fluids do that? Okay, so our body temperature is 98.6 degrees, right? In theory, somewhere in that range. We are required by the state to have AC in the back of our trucks during different temperature ranges, okay? Why? Because we have fluids back there. The fluids are required to maintain a certain range of temperature, okay? We're gonna call that room temperature, and we're gonna say that room temperature is 75 degrees. For some of you, like here in Station 1, room temperature is 62, which is why I'm wearing a vest. But, right, room temperature in the rest of the world is 75 degrees, okay? So we take room temperature fluids that are 75 degrees, and then we put them into a person who is 98.6. So that lowers the temperature. On top of that, they already lost blood before we did that, so their temperature really probably starts in the mid 80s. Right? When that blood goes out, you get colder. Okay? You guys ever given blood? And it's cold in here. Okay? You ever gotten fluids? It's cold in here. Every time, right away, you shiver because you're putting 75 degree fluid into a 98 degree container, so it lowers the temperature and it makes you cold. Right? So one of the problems with hypothermia is when you talk about dilution with clotting, okay, one of the things about temperature is every degree that you drop, your clotting factors don't work as well. Okay, so now you have diluted blood that's still under pressure. We put clear fluids into it, so it's not, that didn't help at all. And then we lower the temperature, which makes it a lot harder to clot, and you're causing a lot of problems. Okay? So we want to limit the number of fluids we're doing because we know it's dangerous. So that's why they came up with that. Okay? That's the dangers of our old way, of the traditional ways. Okay, so after these studies, the science said we got to make some changes. We are causing problems in the field, so we adjust. Okay, it's not about right or wrong as much as it is about learning what's best and pivoting to what's best. Okay, so a better method. What is a better method? A better method starts with how do we determine what is okay? What's a permissive level of hypertension? Okay, so permissive hypertension is a term that came out quite a while ago actually, but it's still newer to taking hold in the field. Right? Permissive hypotension. So just like it sounds, we're going to permit the person to be a certain level of hypotensive. Okay? So now we're going to say that 90 is the number instead of 100. So we're going to say that anything that's 90 or above is okay. Okay? We're going to let it go a little bit further. That's one way. Okay? So 90 or above is okay. Better than that is using mat pressure. Okay? Wilson, can you do me a huge favor? Mm-hmm. Can you run and grab a monitor real quick? So, mat pressure. Okay, so mat pressure stands for your mean arterial pressure. And it is a better assessment tool to determine effusion to the organ than systolic blood pressure is. Okay, it takes more things into account. All right, so there's a formula to come up with mat pressure. Your monitor does it for you. We're going to do the formula real quick. So you're going to take your diastolic pressure plus a third of your pulse pressure. Okay, and that is how you do the formula. None of us are going to be able to do this in the field. This is pretty advanced math for some of us. Probably me, trying to do this right now. Okay, so if you look at 120/80 as your blood pressure, okay, you do your calculations, you're going to end up with 80 plus 40 divided by 3. That's going to give you a mat pressure that's somewhere like 93.3. Yeah, or just 93. Okay? Most of us are not going to remember that or be able to do that. Okay? In the middle of a call. Right? So we're going to figure out a better way to do it. We're just going to forget this exists. And we're going to use our monitor. Okay? So and take our regular blood pressure. Will someone help me with this? Thank you. All right, so we put our blood pressure cuff on and take our regular blood pressure. The cuff's too small.
Mm-hmm. You want to do mine?
Told you. Yeah, man. She's mad dogs because she's not wearing 4 shirts like I am. Wilson, we'll say Wilson put the cuff on there.
Strength that energy.
Some hypertension meds?
Yeah.
Boom. Thank you. All right, so we get a blood pressure. I'll hold this so you guys can see on the camera. Right here next to this, you have a number that's in parentheses. It says 93. Okay, that is her mat pressure. Right, so the monitor will do it for you. So a normal mat pressure on like a A perfectly healthy human is about 93. 120 over 80 equals 93. Hers is 131 over 70. Okay, hers is 93. Perfectly healthy human, regular, just during the day, 93 is your MAP pressure. During trauma, okay, this is the BP method. Okay, the MAP pressure method, we're looking somewhere 60 to 65. Okay, so if we have a MAP pressure that's 60 to 65, we're okay with that. Right, so if you get a blood pressure that's really low, you have a blood pressure in the 60s, okay, systolic blood pressure that's super low, you're going to have a low MAP pressure. We're going to start giving fluids. Okay, and we're going to titrate our fluids based on the MAP. We're just going to continually take blood pressures every 2 to 5 minutes. Okay, and we're going to keep our MAP in this range. We're okay with that. A person can perfuse when they're in this range. If they're above that, they have a blood pressure that's about 90. Their MAP pressure is okay. We don't need to be giving large fluid boluses, okay, because we know it's not doing as much good as we thought it was going to do. Okay, the thing I think about with fluids during trauma is really what you're trying to do is keep them out of cardiac arrest. Okay, that's what the fluids do. I'm going to bring their blood pressure up to a level that allows perfusion. That level is systolic blood pressure of 90, MAP pressure between 60 and 65 in that range. We have these things are achieved. We don't need to keep just dumping fluids to them, because what we're really trying to do is just keep their organs perfusing so that they don't die. Okay? What happens if we're giving fluids and this isn't working? Okay? There's one of two things that's going on, right? Let me erase this better method. First, the number that I really want to look for is less than 1 liter. Okay? If I can successfully run a trauma call, keep the person perfusing, get them to the hospital, and give them less than 1 liter of fluid, they have a lot of good things going on. Okay? So what if I'm giving fluids and I get to that 1 liter mark and it's not working? Okay? We have a problem. The problem is not fluids. They most likely don't have a problem with the amount of fluids they lost. Okay, if you replaced a liter and they're still in trouble, you have a problem with bleeding. It's kind of like thinking about Narcan, thinking about drug overdoses. Okay, is the person's actual problem a lack of Narcan? No. Person's actual problem is a lack of oxygen, right? So we use Narcan to reverse the effects of the opiates so they'll start breathing on their own again. But if I gave them 2 of Narcan or 4 of Narcan or 10 of Narcan, it doesn't really matter. If I called med control and I'm just giving them tons of Narcan, right? Narcan doesn't save their life. Oxygen saves their life, okay? So I want to give them Narcan to reverse it, but in the end, the real problem is the lack of oxygen. That's what I'm worried about. Okay, so if I'm having to give you liter after liter of fluid just to keep your MAP pressure at a certain level, that fluid is going somewhere. Okay? On a blunt trauma, it may be internal and there may be nothing you can do about it, and that person's probably not going to survive. But on a penetrating type trauma, it's most likely that our bleeding control methods didn't work. Okay, so just as important in fluid resuscitation as you're resuscitating the person and I'm looking at the vitals and seeing the results I'm getting, is to reevaluate what I did to stop the bleeding. Ultimately, if we don't stop the bleeding and we replace blood with clear fluids, the patient dies. Okay, so always think about that. Will I go over the liter and break my magic rule to save the person? Sure, because yes, I may cause lots of problems. I may throw their pH to an unreasonable level. I may put them in complete hypothermia. I may do all kinds of stuff. And in that 24 to 48 hour window after they're at the hospital, they may die, okay? But if I don't exceed that level and their MAP pressure drops into the 40 range, they're gonna go into cardiac arrest and they're gonna die in the ambulance in the short term. So this is a ceiling that you can never pass, it's a guideline, okay? But if you're giving more than a liter, start to evaluate what's going on, okay? For me, when I get to the hospital, you see this quite a bit, and this tells me that I didn't do a very good job on the call. You often see this when we try to rush with trauma, we rush too much, okay? We pull the ambulance out of the truck, we drop the legs down after the call is over, and there's blood and fluids leaking from the bottom of the cot. Okay? That person that you put on the cot, everything that you put in is leaking out onto the cot. When you pull it out and you see blood or fluids dripping from your cot, you failed at bleeding control. Okay? So never forget that. Always remember, bleeding control is always first. Fluid resuscitation it should be secondary to bleeding control. Okay? We have to stop the bleeding first. If they're still leaking everywhere, it doesn't matter how much water I put into the system because there's still a leak in the pipe, right? And kind of in theory, if you're at your house and you busted a water pipe, what's the first thing you do? Turn the water off, right? We go over there and we're trying to stop it and spraying everywhere. We're trying to control it. We need to turn the water off, okay? We don't get it stopped and go, hey, turn the water back on, right? We need to turn the water off. So don't be dumping tons of fluid in them, leaving your water on, spraying water all over your floor. Okay, make sure that you get the bleeding stopped, and it's a balancing act back and forth. Okay, any questions, guys? Fluid resuscitation? Pretty straightforward. Stuff is super important, and if you read into late death, if you guys remember some of the earlier videos, we talked about late death from multi-system organ failure. Number one cause of late death and trauma is excessive fluid resuscitation. Okay, so it's a big thing we can improve on.